आपको हक है, मैं अलग जाके व्यक्तिगत रूप से अपना काम करूंगा। आपको हक है मुझसे कहीं कि तुम गलत काम करते हो, प्रधानमंत्री नहीं रह सकते, मैं फौरन निकल जाऊंगा।
It is the story of democracy and India and the institution that, directly or indirectly, has been the foundation of every victory down the decades. Democracy has given India its identity. Power rests in the free voice of the individual, the citizen of this country. That's the ruling motif of democracy. That freedom for the individual to do his will, to choose a leader who will benefit his interests most. The man wanted by the majority is the essence. And it has taken India places. Down these 6 decades, just this power to the individual has transformed how we live and how we work, and how we see the world, and how the world sees us. At the backbone of it all, the Election Commission of India protects and guards and celebrates and enables our democracy. It's the story of democracy and India, and the institution that, directly or indirectly, has been the foundation of every victory down the decades. 15 general elections, more than 300 elections to state legislative assemblies, 13 presidential and vice presidential elections, countless biennial and by-elections to Parliament. It has been quite a record and an unblemished one, and ready to face the future. Our story begins in 1950, a day prior to the dawn of the Indian Republic. Article 324 of the Constitution provided for setting up of an independent constitutional authority to control the electoral machinery of the country without the interference of the executive. On the 25th of January that year, the Election Commission of India came into being. In March of 1950, Sukumar Sen was appointed the first Chief Election Commissioner. The Representation of People Act followed soon after. The elections of 1952 were based on the ideal of universal adult suffrage. Every adult over 21 had the right to choose his representative. No newly independent country had attempted this. Even developed countries of the West had at first reserved the right to vote to men of property. Mobilizing personnel and material across the country was the challenge. Mammoth is a huge understatement. Consider the staggering numbers involved. An electorate of 176 million, 85% of them illiterate, 220,000 polling booths, 2 million ballot boxes, over 72,000 presiding officers and clerks, 280,000 subordinate electoral officials, and 220,000 policemen. And this is just the beginning. It was a time of logistical nightmares. The first of those the Commission has faced and surmounted over the decades. all of which set the stage for what was perhaps the biggest single exercise that independent India had ever undertaken: the general elections of 1952. The electoral journey began on 25th of October 1951 with the first parliamentary elections in the Himalayan state Himachal Pradesh, the planting of the roots of a nascent democracy. This was part of the general elections to be held in the rest of the country in January and February of 1952. Climate constraints due to heavy snowfall cutting off this area from the rest of the country necessitated early polling here. Delimitation and defining of constituencies was also an issue. Altogether, there were 2,438 single and 666 multiple member constituencies. A voter often had to cast his ballot twice to choose his candidate. Considering the low level of literacy, multiple ballot boxes were used, one for each contesting candidate with a symbol. Indelible ink applied to the voter's hand helped prevent impersonation, another first. At one stage, the idea of using smallpox vaccination in place of indelible ink was considered, though it was later dropped. Among those who turned out to vote was a 110-year-old man, propped up by his great-grandsons, and a 95-year-old woman, deaf and hunchbacked. The determination to exercise this power became one of the most notable and abiding features of the Indian electorate. Not surprisingly, these elections were defined as the biggest experiment in democracy in human history. These first elections stood out for the task at hand and its successful achievement. The might of the Election Commission of India had given but its first example: to bow out for the time being for the executive to take over, and to come forward for electoral duty again another day. 5 years later, in 1957, the Election Commission came forward again for the second Indian general elections. 1952 was a massive landmark, and so was 1957. For the pure reason that after this, even the most hard-boiled cynic had to concede that democracy in India had come to stay. Another feather in the democratic cap in 1957 was the emergence of the first serious challenge to the Congress Party. The Communist Party of India came to power in the Kerala Assembly for the first time anywhere in the free world. And a third definitive reason why these elections were special: they cost less than the last one, through diligent use of funds and the skill of reuse and recycling, even alongside the mammoth challenge of reaching out to the deepest interior. The 1957 election exercise is celebrated as a splendid illustration of prudence in public life. Victories for the Election Commission of India, for democracy, and for the people of India again. The turn of the decade, from the nascent innocence of the 1950s to an evolving readiness of the 60s, was a time of change, was new to independent India. The India-China War of 1962, the death of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru were momentous in themselves. And on to Lal Bahadur Shastri, a chill in ties with Pakistan, and the emergence of Indira Gandhi. Goa, Dadar and Nagar Haveli became part of India. An amalgamation of all this and more brought in a political evolution. Under the second Chief Election Commissioner, K.V.K. Sundaram, the Election Commission of India evolved and responded to changing realities. Electorally, the 1960s were about a maturing politics, a sharp influx of candidates eager to feel the magic of being elected to power, the thrill of popular support. Political muscle began to rear its head. That also meant a slew of political parties entering the picture. It gave rise to the need for a more secret marking system for voting. A single ballot paper bearing the name and symbol of all the candidates. And multiple ballot boxes gave way to a single box. Multi-seat constituencies were also discontinued. Also entering the next stage was creating public awareness for registration of voters to induce and encourage them to come to the polling station to vote.
Vote fearlessly and honestly for a stronger nation.
In 1968, after the 67 general elections, the Election Commission made it mandatory for all political parties to register themselves with the Commission. Specified minimum electoral support alone could get them recognition as a national or state party. Election symbols for parties became standard. The late 60s and the political turbulence in state assemblies led to the EC's concern about instability in the states owing to frequent defections. These were the roots of coalition politics and also the basis of what later came to be known as the Anti-Defection Law. Run-up to the 5th general elections in 1972 created the need for checking electoral malpractice. In consultation with political parties, Chief Election Commissioner S.P. Sen Verma laid down guidelines for them during the election process. It had first come about in the states in the 1960s. This has evolved today into the Model Code of Conduct as we know it. It laid down guidelines as to how political parties and candidates should conduct themselves during elections. And it took on powerful proportions in the late 1980s and early 90s. Evolving necessities and the by hook or crook approach also called for greater security to ensure that genuine voters could reach the polling booths. Alongside increased security manpower, the stupendous exercise that conducting elections stood for and organization of the Commission nationwide took definitive shape. This huge election machinery, growing in numbers down the years, is subject to the Commission's superintendence and discipline during the election period, extending over 1.5 to 2 months, before it withdrew again to let the executive take over governance. Three years down the line in 1975, the Congress government declared a state of political emergency. And then, 2 years later, in 1977, a glimmer of hope. In elections, the voice of the people getting an opportunity to assert itself again. And it mattered. For the first time, a non-Congress coalition government came to power in New Delhi. The voter had given his verdict, and it was for the political power and pelf to bow to without debate.
यह संकल्प करते हैं कि
एक, महात्मा जी ने जिस कार्य का शुभारंभ किया उसे हम पूर्ण करेंगे।
The government lasted only 3 years and the Election Commission came forward again.
We will have a poll on the 3rd and the 6th January. The President will issue notification on the 3rd December.
The dawn of the 80s brought with it signals of new age technology in the voting process. The multi-party nature of the system taking its next stride forward. On an experimental basis, electronic voting machines, EVMs, were first tried during the 1982 Legislative Assembly by-elections in Parur, Kerala. This marked the beginning of a process of testing and detailed legal inquiries into the technological aspects of the machines and how they could make the voting, collating and counting process simpler. Then again, in 1984, after the assassination of Mrs. Indira Gandhi, it was time for the ECI to step in again, re-harness the mammoth election process and democratically reinstate a new leader and legislature. In 1989, the President of India decided to make the Election Commission a multi-member body. It lasted only 3 months. It was only in 1993 that a full-fledged 3-member commission came into existence. As a part of an ongoing mission to make the electoral process fairer and more transparent, the Model Code of Conduct, first mooted in the early 1970s, began to get implemented more vigorously. On the technological front, what had started in a small way in Kerala in 1982 was gradually set to become a pan-India assembly election feature in 1998. Electronic voting machines were used in the assembly elections in 1998. In 1999, Goa became the first state to successfully use electronic voting machines in all its assembly constituencies. And they went on to be used in Lok Sabha elections for the first time in 2004. Use of the electronic voting machines made the mammoth polling process simpler, quicker and trouble-free. It has saved money, solved several logistic problems and contributed to conservation of the environment. Counting became fast and accurate. No invalid, no wasted votes. Every vote recorded in the machine became accounted for in favor of the candidate for whom it was cast. Associated to this was the rapid use of information technology in functioning. During the 1999 Lok Sabha elections, the Commission Secretariat was connected directly to nearly 1,500 counting centers across the country. Results were fed into a website directly and were instantly available to eager watchers around the world. For transparency, the media, both print and electronic, was encouraged and provided with facilities to report on actual conduct of the poll and the counting. This, alongside close coordination with media to create awareness among voters. Political parties were allowed free access to state-owned media for their election campaign. Another sign of evolving times, computerization of the ever-growing electoral rolls. Printed rolls as well as CDs were available to the general public and recognized parties. verification of the voter became the key. To improve accuracy and prevent fraud, came the idea of the photo identity card for each voter. In 1993, the Commission ordered issuance of these cards. By 2004, it became mandatory to have one. Voting age reduced from 21 to 18 years, enfolding millions into the voter category, and youth had a more and more definite say. The new century brought all of these evolutionary measures to practice, with the structure, function and officials of the Election Commission giving it teeth and worldwide prestige. The end of the last century and the beginning of this one marked the entry of criminal elements in the political arena. The Election Commission expressed strong concern on the issue. Political parties have been given the onus to ensure against the menace. The Commission has fixed legal limits on the amount of money a candidate can spend during an election campaign. Contestants are required to give details of expenditure later. In 2002, an order was issued wherein each candidate had to submit an affidavit regarding information of criminal antecedents. Failure to do so resulted in cancellation of nominations of several candidates. The 2004 general elections were conducted under these rules. The tenure of J.M. Lyngdoh as Chief Election Commissioner between 2001 and 2004 marked a watershed of sorts in the area of implementation of the Model Code, with further empowerment of the Election Commission of India. Lyngdoh heightened election security in Jammu and Kashmir by mobilizing the local police and paramilitary forces from outside the state. Then, he urged the people to vote fearlessly. 44% did so. Even Lyngdoh's critics acknowledged that the polling had been fair. Many in India seized this triumph of ballots over bullets as a sign that the long-festering crisis of Jammu and Kashmir might yet be resolved peacefully. In the states and at the centre, the Election Commission of India was also active as a quasi-judicial body on election-related issues, with political parties and candidates answerable to it against violation petitions. The Election Commission's task had now grown bigger than ever before, and the determination to hold on to the honesty of the democratic process has kept democracy on track and will continue to do so.
The biggest factor was the solid foundation on which it was built, thanks to the Constitution of India and the framers of the Constitution. Then Supreme Court gave us further power and guarded our autonomy very fiercely. Then the politicians who evolved this Model Code of Conduct, which is a great instrument of peaceful election. And then the bureaucracy which conducts the entire election, when it comes under our control, they deliver a first-rate election year after year. And of course, all my predecessors, 16 chief election commissioners who worked very hard to make this institution as strong as it is today. Then the media has been our friend and ally through this, and of course the people whose participation has been very enthusiastic. We want to involve the people even more, which is why we have decided to celebrate 25th January, which is our founding day, as National Voters' Day. And every year on 1st of January, those who become 18, they will be identified and they will be given their photo identity card. And in simultaneous functions in over 800,000 polling booths, they will be given their this photo identity card as their empowerment. And I think this is the biggest youth empowerment program anywhere in the world.
Down these decades, the functioning, growth and evolution of the Election Commission of India and our democracy, hand in hand, has given out a very special message. One that tells us that the vote in a democracy is not just a piece of paper, or a stamp, or an electronic voting machine, or a button, or the mark on a finger. It is an expression and opinion of right or wrong, wise or foolish, yes or no, and so much more, all at once. And behind it all stands the strong yet non-intruding effort of one of the pillars of our democracy, the Election Commission of India.